Imagine if today was the day your idea changed someone's life. Imagine if you could help someone pay for college, help your community build a new playground, or help a child make it to that dream competition. With GoFundMe, it's all possible. GoFundMe is the world's #1 fundraising platform trusted by over 190 million people. Every week, ordinary people meet their goals and do extraordinary things. Your ideas matter. GoFundMe isn't just for emergencies. Want to raise money for your kid's soccer team or raise funds for a small business, a creative project, or event? GoFundMe helps you turn ideas into reality. And help adds up. Fundraisers you start for someone else raise up to 5 times more. So think right now, who could use your help? Change rarely comes from waiting. It comes from someone deciding, today I'll start. Don't wait for someone else to bring change. Today, start your fundraiser in just minutes at GoFundMe.com. That's GoFundMe.com to start your fundraiser. GoFundMe.com. This is a commercial message brought to you by GoFundMe.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
So long are the days of speed cameras in Ontario.
Because enough is enough. In a few weeks, our government will introduce legislation to ban speed cameras in Ontario to protect taxpayers and drivers and stop them from being gouged.
After weeks of public slander of the radar system, Premier Ford is putting his distaste for them through the legislature, getting rid of the cameras, with plans to turn a page in the province's road safety systems with measures like speed bumps and roundabouts. He claims that it'll change driver behavior before the fact, rather than a ticket in the mail weeks after you were caught on camera. Unsurprisingly, the reaction hasn't been too supportive. Safety advocacy groups, even municipalities, are pushing back on the incoming ban, claiming lives are being put at risk for the sake of saving money. But the Premier, he insists it's a cost of living issue and that his government will find other ways to figure out how to deter speeders without them having their pockets gouged. So what exactly can we expect out of road safety in a world post-speed camera? And what exactly does road safety look like for those who aren't behind the wheel but have just as much of a right to their preferred choice of transportation as drivers do? I'm Maria Castaigne, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Benjamin Wolfe, assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Psychology Department and co-director of the Applied Perception and Psychophysics Laboratory, to get to the bottom of whether or not removing speed cameras are both worth the money and safety risk. Benjamin, thanks for joining me today.
Happy to talk about this.
So let's get into the meat and potatoes of it all. Are speed cameras effective for ensuring road safety? Yes or no?
So frankly, yes. Speed cameras are probably the best way that we have for ensuring safety on the road. Really, this is a case of you can't have a police officer sitting there monitoring speed at every possible location. And the speed camera, much as many people may not like it, is always going to catch you when you exceed the limit. Those limits are set because of the other road users, the other people in that environment. And whether we like getting the ticket in the mail, those are really, meant to help all of us. So the simple answer is yes.
Yes. So Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced incoming legislation to ban speed cameras province-wide and committed to financially helping municipalities to implement other road safety measures like roundabouts and speed bumps. What does the research say about these kinds of traffic calming measures? Are they more effective? Are they effective at all?
So there's an entire sort of ecosystem of these, I would call them infrastructural solutions to changing driver behavior. This is actually something that's been pioneered much more in Europe, where there's this entire concept of self-explaining roads, where you build roadways not just for drivers, but for everyone who's on them, cyclists, pedestrians, etc., but in order to shape behavior. And so roundabouts and traffic calming measures live in that larger space. So do they work? Yes, absolutely. The problem that I see coming from a driver behavior and a traffic safety standpoint is that implementing them is slow and takes considerable funds and considerable effort of will. So if speed cameras go away, tomorrow, what keeps all of us safe until those get built? That would be perhaps my concern there.
Are there other road safety measures besides, speed bumps and roundabouts, and besides speed cameras that you would deem are just as effective, if not more?
So it really depends what behavior you're trying to change and what environment you're trying to change it in. There are all sorts of ways to constrain behavior on the road. So let's say we're talking about, roads through a suburban town. I live out in Mississauga. Let's say you're trying to control road behavior here. Part of that's going to be directing traffic into certain places and not into others. So lane management, setting it up to share space in useful ways. Other pieces of this may involve signage. I recall from the press conference recently that there was a push for visual indicators for driver speed. The sign that says, you were going 53 in a 40 kilometer an hour zone. All of these are a piece of the larger puzzle, but none of them there is no silver bullet here. None of them on their own will solve the problem of how do we keep everyone safe.
You talk about speed cameras and road safety from a behavioral aspect. Who kind of controls what goes into designing a road for, driver behavior or commuter behavior, cyclist behavior? Is that an urban planning kind of discussion, or is that a legislative discussion from, the province? Who kind of makes that?
So there's the question of both who makes it in terms of localized policy and who studies those questions. And so I'll speak to the question of who studies these questions. And that's actually a large ecosystem of researchers, both within academia where I sit and at the provincial and federal level. But you get people studying everything from driver behavior, which is where my own work sits, to people doing traffic planning and traffic safety, all the way to, things like can members of the public read the road signs that you're putting up? So this is actually a very large space of research spanning disciplines, everything, again, from urban planning all the way to studies of vision and cognition and say, aging. So there's lots of work out there. In terms of who makes that policy here in Ontario is actually sort of a stack of different policymakers with different priorities. You have, municipalities and regions making some amount of their own policy. You have the province setting policy. You have federal regulators setting policy. We have huge influences from the rest of North America in terms of what do we expect to see on the roads. And that's been sort of the slow process of standardization for really most of the last century. So I wouldn't say there's, one person who gets to say everything works exactly like this and it should. It's a little more complicated.
A little more complicated. Let's zero in on that one singular person that we're talking about here, Premier Ford. One of his main arguments is that speed cameras are an after-the-fact cash grab that ticket people weeks later for the sake of making money rather than actually preventing speeding before it happens. What do you make of that argument?
So as a psychologist, and that's what I do in my background, speed cameras are one of these great cases of a delayed consequence. So if you want to change behavior, and in many ways, psychology has been interested in how do we change and shape human behavior for many, many years, what you want to do is if you provide negative feedback, which is to say, hi, you get to pay your traffic ticket, it would be nice if it didn't show up in the mail 3 to 4 weeks later. Yes, you get a picture of your car in a particular location and the speed rating of, you were going so fast in this zone. But we have literally a century of research in the field saying that kind of delay is not helpful for actually shaping behavior. That being said, the degree to which that can shape behavior is variable. I've myself been bitten by a speed camera quite close to where I live, and it was, going 42 kilometers an hour in a 30 kilometer an hour zone. It's a school zone. It was outside of school hours, and, I still got the ticket. I paid the ticket, and oh, hey, it's actually shaped my behavior. I don't speed in that particular area anymore. But I think because those delays exist, using them to shape behavior isn't as successful as we might want it to be, and therefore people perceive it as an unwarranted cost when in fact they were moving at excessive speed.
I think the cost factor really plays a big role into this. It's no lie that these speed cameras generate money for the municipalities that they're in. The infamous Parkside speed camera in Toronto's West End, it was knocked down 7 times in less than a year, and it was the city's most lucrative, bringing in more than $7 million. Will the financial hit of getting rid of these cameras severely impact cities and municipalities?
It really depends on what those funds were going for. In the case of the Parkside camera, that camera went in for extremely good reasons. There was a fatal collision there, I believe in 2021 or 2022, that killed 2 elderly, one elderly driver and 1 elderly pedestrian because the vehicle who collided with them was moving at something like twice the rated speed limit. And so there's a certain reason to have that kind of enforcement. At that level, that particular camera was very lucrative when it wasn't being cut down every other week. I think there is some concern of the financial impact, but at some level, the financial concern is reflective of the fact that lots of people are operating their vehicles in an unsafe manner. If you're driving down Parkside, which now has a 40-kilometer-an-hour limit, and you're doing 80, that's not safe for you. The road is not designed for vehicles at that speed, and it's not safe for everyone else around you. And so if the larger concern is both the financial impact to drivers and the financial impact to municipalities, well, the larger goal of having these cameras isn't actually to be a major income source in the long term. It's to shape behavior. And if a given municipality was counting on those funds being available continuously, that's not really the reason to have the cameras in the first place.
Right. And I think just anecdotally, a lot of people, after the Parkside camera just kept getting cut down, they were kind of like, well, how much money does it take to put them back up? Where does this money come from? Where does it go at the end of the day? Where does the money get put towards when these tickets are generated? I think there was maybe a lack of transparency in terms of funding and how that gets donated back to the community.
Right. And with all of these, to my knowledge, no municipality actually runs their own speed cameras. These are all contracted out. With the case of the Parkside camera, as someone who's interested in this larger space and works in this larger space, every time it got cut down, my thought was, well, it got cut down again. There were many excellent engineers in Ontario. We might be able to solve this problem. And so it feels like there's been a focus in that case and in many of these speed cameras, which have a low survivability, of letting it be possible to interfere with them when the goal should be to keep everyone safe, and that's really their purpose.
Imagine if today was the day your idea changed someone's life. Imagine if you could help someone pay for college, help your community build a new playground, or help a child make it to that dream competition. With GoFundMe, it's all possible. GoFundMe is the world's #1 fundraising platform trusted by over 190 million people. Every week, ordinary people meet their goals and do extraordinary things. Your ideas matter. GoFundMe isn't just for emergencies. Want to raise money for your kid's soccer team or raise funds for a small business, a creative project, or event? GoFundMe helps you turn ideas into reality. And help adds up. Fundraisers you start for someone else raise up to 5 times more. So think right now, who could use your help? Change rarely comes from waiting. It comes from someone deciding, today I'll start. Don't wait for someone else to bring change. Today, start your fundraiser in just minutes at GoFundMe.com. That's GoFundMe.com to start your fundraiser. GoFundMe.com. This is a commercial message brought to you by GoFundMe.
Obviously the announcement by Premier Ford of the new legislation wasn't a fan favorite by a lot of people. Lots of safety advocacy groups are pushing back. Several municipalities, some groups even looking to take legal action. Are there concerns regarding safety not being the province's priority valid here?
So that's an interesting thought. I would say that actually Ontario has a long way to come from a road safety standpoint. Speeding is one of the more endemic behaviors here. But because, particularly in the Toronto area, because we have so much suburban and urban sprawl, we're just a gigantic metropolitan area. The question of how do you move everyone around is an enormous problem. We all deal with the joys of GTA traffic, the joys and lack thereof. But how do you keep everyone safe? How do you minimize behaviors that are detrimental to road safety? And road safety, I should emphasize, isn't just drivers. It's drivers, it's cyclists, it's pedestrians. In my area of research, we actually refer to everyone who isn't a driver as a vulnerable road user, because compared to those of us, surrounded by, a couple thousand kilos of steel and glass, they are vulnerable to us. And so the question of road safety, as I talked about a little earlier, is this really multivalent problem. And so I think one of the things that I would, maybe ask Premier Ford to think about is, how do we improve safety for everyone? Not just drivers, not just people who are, stuck on the Gardener trying to crawl in or out of the city, but how do we make this, this place that we all live work for all of us? Part of that probably does include changing road design to change driver behavior. Part of it probably includes changing enforcement priorities if we aren't going to use automated enforcement the way we have. Part of this probably includes pushing for much more public transit use and disincentivizing vehicle use in certain ways. So I think it's a much bigger problem. And from the point of view of someone who studies safety and who studies how drivers understand their environment, taking away speed cameras takes away a tool that could have been used better, but it takes away a tool that, did have some beneficial effects.
It's interesting you bring up that point, because myself, I'm a driver. I don't cycle. I don't walk. I don't really take the subway. I drive, and I have been dinged by a speed camera, so it does sting. And it's really no surprise that Premier Ford prioritizes the drivers of Ontario. He prioritizes their experience. He wants better highways, faster commutes. And as a driver, I can respect that, but I don't make up the metropolitan of Toronto and Ontario at large. And there are commuters that, my road safety as a driver is just as, I have that right just as much as a cyclist and their road safety.
Yeah. And I would say to that, there's even, there's this idea that, as drivers, as I said, I live out in Mississauga. I get to drive everywhere because I'm in the land of suburban sprawl. Thinking, as a driver, thinking about how does my behavior impact others, that's something that is both a road culture question and a road design question. And that's something that, as we look to the future of road safety, again, for everyone in Ontario, but particularly for everyone here in the GTA where the density is so much higher, thinking about how do we make that possible is, I think, a place to look to the future here. If we think about the traffic problem, and no one likes traffic. I completely understand why Premier Ford keeps pushing this idea of, let's widen the 401 ever more. Let's build the tunnel. Let's build additional highways. But the issue of none of those actually solve the problem. That's actually been an issue that's been known in highway design since the 1960s. This idea of, we call it induced demand. As you build more capacity, people use it. And in fact, what one should be doing at a larger policy level is saying, how do we move people where they need to go, let's say in and out of Toronto or within the larger GTA? How do we move them in an efficient, useful to them fashion that may not be on the road, that may look like, the ongoing subway expansions for the Ontario line? It may look like the Eglinton LRT. It may look like the Hurontario LRT. It may look like these pushes to facilitate transport and transit that aren't highways. Going back to this idea of, basically if highway capacity exists, people use it and it fills up and traffic never gets better. Even the planners of the 401 back in the early 1960s recognized this issue. This is not a new issue for the Toronto area at large. And so I think thinking in that particular sense requires us to think somewhat differently now, 60 odd years later.
You mentioned the problem of if speed cameras are banned tomorrow, what happens to the safety of tomorrow, which kind of brings up the broader, more comprehensive costs of taking down speed cameras and putting other traffic calming measures. Although Premier Ford says funding assistance will be provided to municipalities to help with these new measures like roundabouts, I think it's also worth mentioning those broader infrastructural delays that will be caused because of, road closures and constructions. Is that perhaps one of the downfalls of not using a radar system?
I think that's definitely one of the potential issues that's worth thinking about here is that, pushing for these infrastructural changes is at some level a useful change, but implementing them, whether there's provincial support for that to municipalities, actually physically building them is time intensive. It tends to be very slow, and it tends to cause a great deal of resentment during the process and frankly afterwards. In fact, the classic way to constrain behavior on roads isn't just, say, building roundabouts. It's building, I talked about these self-explaining roads early on, where you particularly direct forms of traffic to different pieces of the roadway. So you direct, cars and trucks to the traffic lanes. You direct cyclists to a different lane. You direct pedestrians differently. Again, this is something that's been pioneered, particularly in the Netherlands, and there's been some efforts in Toronto proper to implement this. Given the Premier's dislike for bike lanes, the actual best practices here are, I think, unlikely to receive support.
Yeah, I was going to say, we know that Premier Ford has his eyes on those 3 major bike lanes. I think a perhaps more ideological argument against the cameras is this idea of surveillance. Some more fringe concerns raise issue with being watched unnecessarily, coupled with the fact that, there's no opportunity to defend themselves or provide some sort of discretion on the situation. What do you make of that?
So I think there's sort of 2 pieces there. One of them is, and this is definitely shown up in the Premier's commentary on this, what's the threshold, if you are a municipality that has implemented these systems, what's the threshold that you set for an infraction? If it's a 30 kilometer an hour zone, do you write the ticket at 31 kilometers? That tends to be just a little bit frustrating for drivers. And so that's one piece of this, and thinking about what that gray zone is there is, I think, quite important. The concern about surveillance, I can understand where that comes from. Generally speaking, these systems would actually make that very hard, in so much as, yes, these are doing plate recognition. It's how they know that it's your car. But figuring out that, you passed this camera and then this other camera and then this third camera, and, some nefarious actor can figure out exactly where you've been driving, that would tend to be very difficult with these camera systems. We're not talking a UK highways style heavy speed camera system. We're talking individual radar cameras, and that's a very different ecosystem. I can see where the concern comes from. It strikes me as a little unwarranted.
Do you think auto companies can play some sort of role in taking any responsibility to ensure road safety? We know there's GPS systems will tell you in what area the speed limit is. And I think cars nowadays, some car models will tell you if you're going over the speed limit. But do you think there's any technology that could be perhaps implemented that will detect whether someone's in a school zone or in a residential area and automatically alert them to bring down their speed?
So there are actually systems like this now in a few different forms. Some of them are those, what you were referring to, those are databases of speed by location data. And so a lot of modern vehicles, if you've ever noticed on the instrument cluster where your speedometer is, a little icon saying, this is a 40 kilometer an hour zone, that's coming often from that data. That can be very useful if it's up to date. Google Maps tends to give you this as well. So there is some virtue to providing that signaling. In fact, there's been lots of work in driver behavior from the automakers, both in commercial and non-commercial driving for speed restriction. We don't tend to see it in non-commercial vehicles, but we do tend to see it in commercial vehicles. If you've ever passed a truck or a commercial van on say the 401, and you've seen a bumper sticker that says this vehicle limited to 100 kilometers an hour or 110 kilometers an hour. That's because there's a speed limiter as part of that vehicle. It physically cannot go faster than that. No one, to my knowledge, has ever deployed these at scale for non-commercial drivers because it is wildly unpopular. If we think that speed cameras have been unpopular in Ontario, the idea that, if you were going to, sell a car or license a car in the province, that you could only take it up to 120 kilometers an hour, nobody would be happy. Even those of us who work in road safety would not be happy. So there's definitely some pieces out there. Maybe the more beneficial pieces that are coming, that are on the market now and moving into new vehicles would be what we call advanced driver assistance systems. And these are, you might think of them as, some of them are things like keeping you in your lane, keeping basically the car maintaining some operational control to make the job of the driver easier. Could you imagine one of those systems having a speed element to it and using that data that we were just speaking about? I know I'm in a zone, where the limit is X, and if I'm doing, too much beyond that, the vehicle will intentionally slow me down. You can imagine that. I don't know of anyone deploying those, but the technology certainly exists.
Do you think there could be some sort of system, here in Ontario, or I guess in Canada at large, where residents could vote on whether or not their municipalities have speed cameras? Like, do you think it could be a case-by-case situation?
I think it very much could be. It would be, my feeling is that it would be relatively unlikely to get support at a municipality level if it went up for, a popular vote. People often like the idea of road safety. They often don't like the approaches that we have to take to get there.
My last question for you, Benjamin. What kinds of conversations do you think will be playing out in the weeks to come at Queen's Park or at the grassroots level? Do you think there could be some sort of reversal of the ban?
I would be surprised if there was a reversal at the level of the province, in so much as the Premier has, really, found a good thing to talk about in the cameras. I do expect a lot of grassroots resistance to it, in so much as there are lots of cases of excessive speed resulting in collisions, injuries, and fatalities. In fact, the best example that comes to mind is, you may recall from January that a driver moving at excessive speed collided with Premier Ford's vehicle, and then subsequently, about 6 months later, wound up in a second fatal collision, killing a father of three. That case is both tragic and illustrative of the province's larger issues with speeding and enforcement. And so I think the question of how do we handle this larger speeding issue, which we do have as a province, and we have this question of how do we keep everyone on the roads safe, including the Premier. How do we do that? I think needs to be a larger, more granular conversation than let's just sweep away this one tool that has become politically unpopular.
Benjamin Wolfe, Assistant Professor at the University of Toronto and Co-Director of the Applied Perception and Psychophysics Laboratory. Thanks so much for a very great chat today.
Happy to.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Reach us on X at TheBigStoryFPN or send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. If you know someone you think would enjoy this episode, well, share it with them. Don't forget to rate and leave a comment, of course. You can get your daily fix of The Big Story every morning on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Maria Castaigne. Thanks for listening.